Thank you, Moises and Antonio, for inviting me and giving me the chance to talk about a very recent and ongoing project on the politics of economic development in China. Let me
Goethe University was, and he was also.
Do you hear me? Because I sometimes hear voices.
Yes, I can hear you, Tobias, but I think Moises has an echo. I think perhaps on the YouTube, I'm not sure.
No, yeah. So do you see my slides now?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Okay, great. Okay, let me start then. China, or the People's Republic of China, represents a paradox for much scholarship, we think. The country has experienced a continuous rise in GDP per capita in the last decades. And despite huge regional heterogeneity, may achieve a high income in the 2020s. Yet all of this happens in an authoritarian setting. And what is more, it seems that technological upgrading and the long-term plan to master cutting-edge digital technologies are even gaining momentum in the last years. So when you look at the economics literature, there is, of course, a lot on the sources of China's economic rise and its continuation, rightly emphasizing, for instance, the advantages of catch-up development, benefiting from a structural change process. That means substantial reallocation of labor from agricultural to non-agricultural sectors, as well as a shift from primarily labor-intensive to increasingly capital-intensive industries. However, the political conditions and the factors that have underpinned this growth performance are the subject of much debate. And to address this debate, I present here some conceptual ideas and empirical findings from a short book that reviews and discusses the politics of China's economic development experience in its most developed regions, and which also explicitly aims to reach non-China experts. This is done together with Alexandre de Podesta Gomez and Armin Müller, both also working at Jacobs University, Bremen. So what will I do now? I start with some concepts and our analytical framework. I will then trace the role of what we call three political conditions for development over two time periods, one from the 80s to the early 2000s, and the second one from the mid 2000s to the 2020s. To then assess recent efforts to upgrade technology. The book will also focus on skills a bit, but I will not do this today. And I'd end then with some future research avenues, because some of our findings, and indeed in the wider literature, they are pretty tentative. And I come back to this later. Okay, so to start with, this slide here shall give very rough illustrations on economic development, narrowly defined here as GDP, per capita growth. There's a right-hand graph which gives you data from 1995 to 2019. China is the blue line and sees some steep increases. Brazil and Mexico are above when it comes to GDP per capita, but you see that there is more of a stagnation in these countries. And then other countries who were stronger at the very beginning of the process, Indonesia, for instance, has seen some increases, but has been outcompeted, if you like, by China. So this shows you quite something. China did move from low income to upper middle income relatively fast. That's in a nutshell what you see here. The other graph on the right hand, however, also shows that this rise may flatten in the present, because annual GDP per capita growth is losing momentum, especially after the 2010s. And there are other indicators as well, such as stagnating productivity, which are also interpreted by many as an indication for problems on the way to high income. And indeed, Chinese power elites are afraid of the so-called middle income trap, for instance, what they call 中等收入陷阱. Yeah. And this leads us to two key questions which we would like to answer in this short book. First of all, the political factors explaining the transition, the quick transition to upper middle income. Of course, we deal here with related obstacles and problems too. And then secondly, a focus on the current obstacles in this aimed transition to high income status. Okay, so this shall give you a rough idea of the theoretical traditions we build on. We try here to review and link several and often unconnected or disconnected literatures. First, we utilize insights from China studies. This is a literature, for instance, on the party state and bureaucratic restructuring, on central local relations, on skills, labor, and also, of course, on state business ties. Second, we employ findings on the embedded autonomy of state bureaucracies and paradoxes of economic development. That was on the embedded autonomy of state bureaucracies and a literature on state business ties and upgrading coalitions from development studies to the developmental state debate and so forth. And then thirdly, findings from comparative political economy situate us amongst those who stress A, the, say, dirty realities and paradoxes of economic development wherever it takes place, and then B, the need to have a transnational analytical focus. A word on methodology here. We write this book, so this is an ongoing process, as I mentioned, although we aim at submitting a draft in a month. We are here in the tradition of in-depth qualitative national case studies, and we take an approach then based on necessary and sufficient causes or conditions. 3 of those necessary conditions I will show you in a second. And then we triangulate findings from the literature from offline and online fieldwork in China before and during the pandemic, as well as national and local statistical data and other primary data. Okay, so this is the analytical framework in a nutshell. We focus on 3 key political conditions that have to be met when achieving development outcomes in terms of GDP growth and R&D, technology development and these issues. And the 3 political conditions we focus on are a development-oriented bureaucracy with functional government agencies. That's number 1. Number 2 is instrumental intra-state ties to guarantee policy implementation. And number 3 are economically productive state business coalitions. I will introduce and discuss them in more detail later. Of course, other factors are relevant too. I mean, at the bottom of this slide, I have added some. I mean, I already mentioned the economic conditions or structural change processes about which we really do not focus on in this book. But then there are also other external pressures or transnational influences that have of course, influenced China's development. And we are not dealing with those in any detail, apart from the role of foreign direct investment. And I come back to this later as well. So 3 political conditions, which are necessary conditions, if you like, to achieve a good development outcome, if you like. A word on state business coalitions, maybe. It is more acknowledged than, let's say, 20 years ago, especially in development study, that coalitions between the state and businesses are one crucial political precondition to foster economic development. This goes, of course, against the mainstream neoclassical view, which emphasizes arm's length relations. However, in reality, and if you like it or not, thick state business relations can function indeed as productive hand-in-hand relationships where the resulting interdependence may be beneficial or even inevitable if economic development is to take place. The supportive role of these coalitions is, for instance, exemplified by Japan's or Korea's rise. And conversely, their absence is shown by some authors regarding other middle-income countries, which for several decades have struggled to upgrade. However, this is very important. What you need is not always what you get. And therefore, we have to be aware of the obstacles and inherent problems, if you like, of these three necessary conditions we focus on. So if you talk about the bureaucracy, for instance, we need to ask, how cohesive is this state bureaucracy really? Has it enough autonomy to prevent state capture, for instance? Is the selection of bureaucrats, for instance, based on merit, or is it rather based on patronage? And these questions we need to ask. And then regarding functional government agencies, so also in this first necessary political condition, do we have something like a pilot agency, such as in the successful development processes in South Korea and Japan, so the famous METI, or the Economic Planning Board in Korea, or do we see fights between ministries over bureaucratic authority, for instance? Regarding intra-state ties, it is of course important that state bureaucrats must be able not only to design, but also to implement and monitor specific policies. And the question then emerges whether there is really an alignment of policy design at central level and policy implementation at local levels. Very important for the case of China, as we will see later. And there's of course a big debate then on whether too much centralization is a problem and or whether too much decentralization is a problem. Last not least, I already discussed the role of state business coalitions as an important part of this framework here. Yes, you can have interest alignments. However, what about power relations in those coalitions? Are they symmetric? Are they asymmetric? These kinds of questions we have to take into consideration, as well as cleavages within business, such as when the dominant position of foreign capital in some cities in China, coastal cities, for instance, reduces the upgrading space for domestic firms. And I also come back to this point later. Okay, this leads me to the next slide, which is this first time period we focus on in the book, and about which I give some sort of overview here. And again, I will look into the three necessary conditions firstly, and then I look a little bit into the outcome to then go into the second time period. Okay, so regarding the building up in China since the 1980s of a development-oriented bureaucracy and functional government agencies, there is indeed quite good research which is focusing at least on 4 dimensions, which were, on average, advantages to economic development. The first is that already in the 1980s, the party state launched concrete targets related to economic growth as the main criteria to evaluating cadres, local and national alike, to advance to higher levels on the career ladder. Whether you have achieved economic growth or not was key. Second, the Communist Party of China used systematically its apparatus from the 1980s onwards to monitor state and party cadres by appointing them, demoting them, transferring them, and so forth. Thirdly, there was the establishment of a national civil service. And that meant that public sector personnel indeed was to be selected through open competitive examinations. So that is this idea of building a bureaucracy which is more based on merit than maybe patronage, although this is of course never ruled out, even if you have competitive examinations. Anyways, this has been built, and what has also been built or rebuilt is the government are the government agencies, the ministries, because they, of course, had to serve new realities of a more market-oriented economy, which was, as you all know, drastically reformed from the 1980s onwards. And what happened here, in a nutshell, industrial sectorial ministries inherited from the Maoist era, such as the ministries of coal or the machine building or so, they were merged and incorporated into the so-called State Economic and Trade Commission. So there was kind of a change here. In 2003, this Economic and Trade Commission was merged with the State Planning Commission to create one central agency for controlling and organizing industrial development, namely the National Development and Reform Commission, the famous NDRC, or Fagai Way, as the Chinese call them, which was at that time, in 2003 and onwards, widely depicted as a potential candidate for a pilot agency, such as the MITI in Japan. Okay, so this first condition here. Definitely many things did happen to make it more efficient. Regarding intrastate ties, to make a very long story short, the 1980s led to the rise of local state autonomy. This initially led to a lot of collusion and tax evasion, for instance, which then in 1994 led to a huge tax reform. And this then altered the incentive structure shaping the behavior of local governments. And the direction was now drive industrial growth by any means. And that then included a shift from rural industrialization to urban infrastructure development, the establishment of industrial parks and development zones for manufacturing, and a booming real estate market as well. On the other hand, this local state autonomy under hierarchy, of course, led to a huge success overall with experimentation processes, local experimentation with markets, stock markets, and new institutions that, when interpreted as successful by the national government, were then universalized across the country. Regarding state business coalitions, maybe as a background, party state elites in China had been in a dominant position for a long time, because in the 1940s and 1950s, they wiped out a powerful landlord class and a then nascent bourgeoisie, which fled also to other countries, of course. And the party state filled a huge political vacuum. In the 1980s and then onwards, a new class of entrepreneurs emerged, however. And this included, first of all, that the initial hostile environment for private ownership was minimized over time, and that then many entrepreneurs, even private entrepreneurs, enjoyed much greater social status and so forth, and even started to organize themselves into business associations and the like. Most of all, especially at the local level, close ties between state bureaucrats and businessmen emerged. The businessmen in those coalitions, they did not challenge the supremacy of the party state. Rather, they were integrated into the wider political system with, of course, ultimate control held by higher party state levels. And in reality, it led to a multiplicity of competing local coalitions on the ground. Some have called them, Jean Oy and others, local developmental states, in which local party bosses, for instance, were at the helm of the local economy. They coordinated enterprises within their territory as if they were kind of managing a diversified business group or so. Or other forms of local coalitions in which local cadres, officials started to invest directly and set up their own businesses. The famous red capitalists that emerged, especially from the 1990s onwards. And there were also local coalitions, especially in coastal China, where you had strong foreign influences as well. So Suzhou is a very good example, coastal, almost at the coast, important city, which had strong influences, especially by huge multinational firms. And they became part of local coalitions as well. Let me see. The outcome then, I think I should move on. The outcome, the dominant outcome, of course, of that era is, I think, can be quite well summarized by the idea of growth by any means. But there was also, relatively speaking, elite unity. However, over time, the government argued that there are problems: a lack of indigenous innovation, dependence on FDI in the most advanced sectors, and then a lot of collusion and corruption on the local level, including what the central government called an implementation gap. Two factors were probably chiefly responsible for the attenuation of very harmful effects of intimate connections between state officials and private, semi-private, and state entrepreneurs into the 2000s. First of all, I mentioned this in passing. In China's decentralized system, different localities, or in other words, different local coalitions, competed against each other. So, and this competition limited the extent of unproductive spending and the worst effect of rent seeking, as several authors argue. And then second, local competition still was based on growth-related targets set by the central government, which meant that the fact that China's national ruling coalition did not face any significant threat of being overthrown or really challenged, permitted it to emphasize productive engagement and to evaluate and, of course, monitor local officials accordingly. Okay, so that's kind of the first time period, and I need to move on to the maybe more interesting, more recent period, from the mid-2000s to the 2020s. What is important here? As already indicated, by the mid to late 2000s, China's national ruling coalition identified the combined problems of overdependence on foreign technology, as they argued, a lack of indigenous innovation, a single-minded focus on GDP growth, and a lack of policy coordination and excessive power of local officials, often subverting central directives. Against this backdrop, the call for indigenous innovation became a new dominant paradigm, we would argue, along the lines of many China scholars such as Ling Chen and Barry Norton and others. To go back now to what did that mean for the three conditions we look at in most detail. We had a further reform of the party-state bureaucracy. For instance, a new civil service law was enacted with the aim to assure greater loyalty, especially among non-party members, and to prevent factional splits. You should know that among the 40 million plus cadres in China, 25 million are non-CCP members. So this was one important step that probably had that had the aim to assure greater loyalty. Then there was a huge anti-corruption campaign, that is the one under Xi Jinping. Here, unlike previous campaigns, Xi Jinping's campaign had a special target on high-level corruption, the so-called tigers. And the campaign has indeed reached every possible corner of the party state, infusing some fear in local officials, which of course leads to the question of the effects of this campaign on maybe dismantling China's cronyist, or however you want to call them, local growth coalitions. And then thirdly, I think time showed that the NDRC was no pilot agency as planned. Rather, other ministries, I mean, that is not to deny the enormous role of the NDRC in the process of achieving indigenous innovation. But however, it never achieved this kind of pilot agency status because other ministries challenged its role. The Ministry of Science and Technology, for instance, and then only founded in 2008, but pretty strong in a short period of time the Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, a new industry, MIIT. And that led to a further round of intra-bureaucracy competition, for instance, between the MIIT and the NDRC, competing in terms of formulating policies, for instance. Regarding intrastate ties, there's of course a lot of debate on the re-centralization of under Xi Jinping. And indeed, there were some re-centralization measures. So for instance, in 2015, local governments were ordered to detach themselves from local government financial vehicles, the so-called LGFVs, which were at the center of the old growth dynamism, if you like, based on the conversion of rural to urban land, the setting up of development zones and FDI attraction, and so forth. The rationale behind these measures was to tighten the control over local agents to curb corruption, but also to minimize popular discontentment. And then, secondly, in this field of central-local relations, there was a lot emphasis and new emphasis on target diversification. And that, of course, was part of the innovation-driven development paradigm. So going away a bit from the single-minded weight on GDP growth and towards more long-term objectives connected to technological upgrade and skills reform as well. And here, target diversification was promoted. So new targets such as patents applications, the number and total output of high-tech companies, exports of high-tech companies, and so forth. This came to the fore and has been reformed in the last 10 to 15 years. Yet, with a limited leeway, so with some sort of limiting the leeways of local governments and some more monitoring, there's a big debate in China studies, unresolved in our view so far, that maybe this leads to a stifling of local initiative. And I come back to this point later again. Last not least, regarding the state business coalitions, here what is I think key important is that the necessity to use businesses to also obtain industry-specific information became a key task, a key challenge. Because if you promote industrial innovation policies, you need industry-specific information. And who can deliver this? Of course, businesses and their associations, they could. And this interest of easing information flows is at the heart of a trend that we call the institutionalization of consultative mechanisms. What does that mean? It refers to the more influential role over time of local business associations in close contact with local governments and increasingly the science system. Information sharing can happen through local chambers of commerce, with the All China Federation of Industry and Commerce, a national business association even. And then, very importantly, within local and national consultative bodies, such as the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conferences and the People's Congresses. Interestingly, entrepreneurs and also the business associations, they still have a considerable scope for their operations, of course, within the political limits set tacitly or explicitly by the party state, as indicated by the recent crackdown on big tech, for instance. This can reach anybody. However, under normal circumstances, there is scope for business operations. And then notably linked to the reality of competition between different local coalitions, local business associations also do not form cross-regional alliances, but normally pursue their own local interests. And that also has some downsides, as I will mention in some minutes. The outcomes here let me push the button. There was still quite strong growth, but it was weaker, of course, probably also very much related to the economics and not just the politics of China's development, of course. There was still relative elite unity. Many of the reforms, by the way, that Xi Jinping has initiated have been discussed, and we would even argue quite a consensus emerged that he did what he did before Xi came to power. Okay, so a relative elite unity still, we would argue, and at the same time, so while there's also really efforts and achievements in domestic innovation, I come back to this in the next slide. So there's also continued dependence on foreign technology, and then while implementation capacity may have increased, there is the open question of how much this has hampered local initiative. There is anecdotal evidence which goes in this and that direction. We might discuss this later. The easing of information flows, however, between state and business, I think, has been improved for quite some time. Okay, let's move on. And I will definitely stick to my 40 minutes, I guess. Here you have some very rough indicators giving you an idea about the results of all the efforts put into technology development. So on the left hand, you have expenditures on R&D, which are very much on the rise in the last 20 years, from almost nothing to, if you then measure this as R&D intensity, so that is R&D in percentage of the GDP, it has now reached 2.something%, which is quite well if you compare that to other middle income economies in particular, but is of course below the leading economies on earth. When it comes to R&D personnel, also not very surprisingly, there's a big rise in the number of R&D personnel. There is, however, and this is also shown in the left-hand graph, there is quite a stagnation in basic research expenditures, which is interesting, and I come back to this in a second. And then last not least, this is another rough indicator. I know it has all kinds of problems to it. If you look at patents, total patents applications go through the roof. However, if you only focus on those patents which are of a somewhat better quality, so invention patents, the applications, that's the orange line here, is already much below the overall patents applications. And if you then look at granted patents, the number is not as high as maybe many in the West would expect these days. What we would argue is, and we could discuss this later, of course, that you see successes, of course, enormous achievements. However, overall, it is more mixed than, especially when compared to the very high aims in the plans that the government unveil every other day. And also when compared to the fears in the West, at least, I would be interested to know what you in Brazil encounter these days in public discourse, that China is kind of going to overtake the rest of the world very soon. In other words, with a one-sided focus on the success stories, so the Huawei, Xiaomi, Tencent, big tech firms, you really miss numerous companies, for instance, which struggle a lot to upgrade and also lack absorptive capacities. Okay, so this leads me to assessing these mixed results in technology development. Regarding the bureaucracy and government agencies, on paper, at least, the central government in China is really willing to speak with one coherent voice. And this is, of course, also what reaches us in the West and maybe in Brazil. That's a question to you, or in Mexico. The reality of China is this: while there is unity on paper, difficulties emerge when plans reach the state bureaucracy and the arena of interministerial competition. So for instance, regarding these new targets, there's evidence that quantity, not quality, still is dominant. So if you look to patent applications, the one graph I showed you, the evaluations here are very short-term, carried out every year, and that created short-term pressures on Chinese research to patent everything they could. The result is not much quality. Yes, they satisfied evaluation targets, but they didn't satisfy the overall long-term goal of more technology upgrading, maybe. Then, despite the centralization drive and some sort of ministerial restructuring with the MIIT, for instance, the past years, there is still fragmentation, which has been shown by numerous studies in the last years. I'll give you one example here on the photovoltaic industry, one so-called strategic emerging industry. And here, multiple central state agencies put forward different policy agendas, often set up independently from each other, and that then undermined the central state capacity to coordinate and regulate the industry nationally. The photovoltaic industry is not the key story that the Chinese government is now telling. Yeah, it's not so successful actually, but this is maybe more the rule than having these success stories only. Regarding, so in other words, I think we should aim here for a realistic assessment. Yeah, you don't need to overrate China, you don't need to underrate China, you need to have a realistic assessment. Regarding the intra-state ties to guarantee policy implementation, yeah, what is happening here? Local governments these days are very active in establishing high-tech zones, new high-tech zones, and incubators and all kinds of innovation infrastructures, if you like. But often this expansion lacks central monitoring. And since local governments are very often still driven by the quick commercialization of new products, because those can bring commercial returns shortly or in the short term, this has a downside, which means that especially investments in basic research have been lagging in China, representing a weak component in China's innovation system, if you like. Other things that are relevant here, several studies on strategic emerging industries, they find regional duplication of investments, also in R&D. This is, of course, driven by these competing local states or local state coalitions. And we also did a study on the semiconductor industry for this book. What we find here, that since promotion within the party state hierarchy is, how to say, is tied up to the attraction of large scale investments, yet regardless of ownership, this leads to a situation in Suzhou, for instance, I mentioned coastal Suzhou already, that considering the local initial competitive advantage of global firms, global semiconductors firms in relation to Chinese newcomers, local officials, especially in Suzhou, with those very strong relations to foreign firms, they were eager to attract and support foreign capital, not necessarily domestic Chinese. Yeah? In Suzhou, you have established a plan from UMC. This is the main Taiwanese competitor of TSMC, and it's not Suzhou domestic firms which have risen in the last years. Yeah? It's still foreign firms which are big. Suzhou and other firms are rather only strong in segments of the semiconductor industry, which are more labor intensive still, the more capital and R&D intensive parts. Yeah, there are only a few Chinese who can really compete with the leading South Korean, Taiwanese, Japanese, and so forth companies. And then regarding coalitions, as I mentioned before, there is progress with regard to information sharing, these consultative mechanisms, if you like, to design suitable policies. And that also means central state governments, they talk to businesses. What we found, for instance, in the semiconductor industry, that indeed there is intensive communication. So we studied policy proposals at local people's political consultative conferences. And here you find interesting discussions between indeed local businesses and local bureaucrats to strengthen the needs of the industry through policy. A trend then is a new trend, and by new I mean last 10 years, is to build not only, let's say, state business coalitions, but state business research coalitions, what in innovation studies is discussed as the triple helix form of bringing together actors from the state, from business, but also from the science system. And here China, especially in the coastal areas, Pearl River Delta, for instance, are building innovation intermediaries to achieve the idea of innovation platforms. This is, of course, very hard because many manufacturing centers, take the Pearl River Delta, take Shenzhen, they had no science system at all until very recently. They're now building, they have been building it up, but it's of course not like Beijing or Shanghai. Yeah? So therefore, it's also very hard to achieve state business research coalitions. And I can come back to this later if you like. And then last not least, unproductive collusion still continues to play a role. Unsurprisingly, I would argue, since, for instance, bureaucrats often do not have the technical knowledge to judge whether a firm is really able to promote upgrading, they can be fooled. And this is also shown in the semiconductors study, where, for instance, in Wuhan, one big firm drawing enormous amounts from Wuhan government completely failed. And yeah, this is not the only example out there. So in other words, the state is strong, yes, but it is not omnipotent. And yes, also coalitions are pretty helpful, but they also do not represent the kind of magic formula that helps everything, that helps solving every problems and to go high income very, very quickly. This brings me to my very last slide, future research avenues. And here I mentioned 4, and maybe you have others, because as mentioned before, some of the findings we discuss in the book are pretty tentative. This is, for instance, this also holds for this centralization moves under Xi. There's a lot of discussion going on the centralization measures, but there's also not much substance, indeed. If you look at fiscal centralization, there is actually not much of a centralization going on under Xi. Yeah. So in other words, there is the need to, in more detail, look at really whether there's administrative centralization or maybe there's a fiscal centralization and so forth. And here I think that the research has only just started. And of course, it's also not so easy to do it, that we have to say, of course, too. Then these mechanisms for information sharing between businesses and the state during this indigenous innovation period, I think these have to be studied in more detail. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence here and there, but I think there's room to improve. Third, we need to be aware of technology development obstacles, which even exist in the strongest of all middle income economies. Yeah, and I have mentioned some, I want to repeat them here. Bureaucratic fragmentation is an important problem. The same goes for, of course, I didn't touch upon this, I wanted to at least touch upon this in the very end. A lack of skilled workers can be another very big issue, and China has a problem here too. Same goes for absorptive capacities of firms. And of course, there is the need to be doing research on the different types of foreign capital that came to China and the effects of their actions on the mainland. And that is the last point, leads to the very last point. There are also signs, for instance, that you can indeed have productive foreign domestic collaborations, which would then identify the need for open national innovation systems. I'd like to stop here should probably stop sharing my screen, right? Yeah.
Thank you very much for this very insightful presentation. And I think Antonio could make some comments just to kick off the debate.
Yes.
Thank you, Tobias. I just want to grab a glass of water first. No, thanks for your excellent.
Yes.
I hope it's water. Thanks for an excellent and incredibly fascinating presentation. Very, I mean, all encompassed, but at the same time, very to the point and very in depth. And also, really have to congratulate for your synthetical capability, of presenting such a huge, topic and such a huge debate, to us, and in a very clear and well-structured manner. So I was really, thank you for that, all of us. I just wanted me to just kick off the debate, and I had just like two questions. One has to do with the whole issue when China has moved into the innovation development type of development, and you talked about this being a target diversification. And one question I had is more like a question, more empirical question, of whether the continuation of the monitoring that some of the central state did of the local efforts is it all feasible within this target diversification mode, because it seems like the way you presented it, and perhaps in my problem with the interpretation, but I'd like to double check on that, whether is monitoring it seems like the mode of monitoring that the central state has done, for development, perhaps is not feasible anymore when you move into a technological innovation development driven economy. Because for some of the issues that you raised, like bureaucratic infighting, but also lack of knowledge on the part of the bureaucracy, and so and so. So the question to me is it monitored still possible? So it's a very generic, but at the same time, which I just hope you can enlighten me more in the empirical part of it, because I'm just using my logic to figure that out. In a broader question, in a way, is relation to also to the new developments you mentioned about this and the business state coalitions, where they start a new information sharing. To what extent, has that hit a ceiling, from what you read about this spats between the central government and large companies? Because you briefly mentioned at the very end of your presentation on how a lot of these businesses that don't want to really open information to the central government or to even to the local governments anymore. They have a different dynamics, they're more internationalized, and that brings me to mind, what's his name? Young, discussion about developmental states in Asia, and how when businesses grow, they become more internationalized and they kind of they detach themselves from the states. And I wonder if that has happened in China, but the solution in China hasn't really met, the same solutions that the Korean state or the Singaporean state had. So I just wonder if you could comment on that. And the final sort of general question that derives from that, is whether it's a political driven technological or innovation development is still feasible or possible at all. Because you seem to be pointing, in that direction. You said that when there's a lot of efforts, you're going to triple helix, blah, 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 blah. But I just want to hear what's your opinion, whether if it's political development is still possible. Thank you. Sorry for my taking so long. Moises, you want to add your question so he can answer in a pack, and then
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think it's better this way.
Thank you so much.
Well, it's interesting to see on your presentation that Deng Xiaoping, to what extent, to a certain extent, he had sort of foreseen these things, and it was really genius, because I was reading that, for example, the issue of bureaucracy, a more efficient and professional bureaucracy, it was on Deng Xiaoping's agenda. And the decentralization was also on his agenda. And I liked one comment that you made on your book about the Chinese uniqueness, in the sense that this culturalist interpretation of Chinese uniqueness is not very sound. I totally agree with that. And I remember that this idea of decentralization was also, economically speaking, was also Deng Xiaoping's idea on the 1,000 Singapores metaphor. And also this experience with bringing the learning from Japan, learning from South Korea, and this ethnic this ethnic entrepreneurialism, which is also so my main question would be because China is very fast to change, to adapt, to learn. From what I read, unfortunately, I never had a chance to do research in China. I'd love to, but from what I read, China is really is probably the country the most institutional learning and adapting. And so my question in this sense would be, there is this path dependency from growth by any means from the previous period, and at the same time you have this experimentation, and this fast this experimentation, which is very relevant for I mean this learning capability, institutional learning, maybe we could say. And so how do you see this point? How do you strike this balance in this new research?
So can I ask you again, Moises, can you please retell, so what balance between growth by any means?
Yes, between the path dependency from growth by any means,
yeah,
and the need for experimentation in this new stage, in this new phase.
Okay. Now I get it. How do you want me to proceed here? Should we also have other questions, or should I start with answering some at least? Or what is the procedure?
Time, because perhaps you collect a couple of other questions. I mean,
yeah, maybe.
You rather collect more questions, or Tobias?
Yeah,
or you answer those
it's up to you. If you want to answer these first questions now, and then we have another block of questions, or we can still pick up some more 2 or 3 questions.
It's already quite a lot, I have to say. So maybe it would be better if I try to answer some, at least very shortly.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Okay.
Open to the audience now for further questions.
Yeah. That's right.
Thanks for those attending all the webinar, for waiting for your questions.
So maybe I start by answering in reverse order. Starting with Moises' question, maybe there was a miscommunication on my side. So when I introduced the growth by any means time period, what I meant is that as part of this process was experimentation. So this is not really something new, rather experimentation at the local level with markets, with stock markets, with all kinds of institutions that were kind of to be implemented in this market, this period in which markets were kind of emerging. This was actually part and parcel of this growth by any means period. Experimentation still is relevant today, of course. The question is whether there is a lot of experimentation under Xi Jinping. So this is one of the open questions, actually. And here I'd like to be a bit tentative, because in my own research on innovation intermediaries from some years ago, it's actually still ongoing, but we were in China like 3 years before the pandemic. We didn't see much of a hampering of Xi Jinping centralization in this field. They are experimenting with Chuangxin Pingtai. That's the term for innovation platforms. They build all kinds of weird stuff we would maybe think in the West, but some of the stuff works out. Okay. some of those innovation platforms are now quite big and relatively successful. So in here, there was experimentation, if you like. And so we did a study on so-called new R&D institutes in the Pearl River Delta. In some sense, this is something, this already goes to Antonio's question on the state-driven innovation development, whether this is possible or not. In some sense, China is throwing billions of yuan into the system, and it hopes that something comes out at the end. It is this what Barry Norton calls the big bet in current China. There's a big bet on you spend billions and billions and billions on innovation efforts, and hopefully some will work out nice. Indeed, some did work out pretty nice in the last 10, 15 years, if you compare it to the preceding period. Yeah, we have high-tech firms in China. There are many. There's a lot of progress in terms of how universities interact with firms. There was almost nothing 20 years before. Now there are these triple helix institutions, at least in some parts of coastal China, and especially there. But it is, of course, a big bet approach, and lots of finance is going to go nowhere. So, in terms of leading to any sort of innovation. The question on Deng Xiaoping, of course, Deng Xiaoping probably said many clever things, but I think I would still stress that the actual decentralization and reform measures at the end of the 1970s were mostly the result of different reforms were created by different unknown people working at the local level. And this was for the sheer survival of the party state. I mean, in the mid to end of the 1970s, there was not big China. Yeah, China was in a very big crisis. And then I think everything that would increase national output had a valid place. Yeah. And some of these reforms sometimes indeed initiated not by the central government, but very often spontaneously on the ground. These are the experiments. These are the kinds of experiments, I mean, that were then interpreted as successful. So, for instance, the changes in the rural systems in the early 1980s, these are a good example of it. They had been then interpreted as useful and were then universalized across the country. So that is this on Deng Xiaoping. And then another one, crackdown on big tech. I think the discussion currently, we have to differentiate a bit. So there are some measures these days which go, which are in line with the quality growth idea, and with the idea that there should be some sort of social equality in this country. Some other issues are to do with especially big tech, to have the state not lose control over finance. That's Alibaba, that's Jack Ma. Yeah. So because his kind of empire has become quite big, and the state does not want to lose control, A, over finance, and B, over data. So these are, of course, key issues for the central government, on which they want to keep control. This might lead to problems, of course, over which the government is not yet so sure. Yeah. The monitoring question, very shortly, I think this is one of the questions for which I have no clear answer. And more research has to show whether indeed the old monitoring techniques still work or not. Yeah. For now, monitoring is in place, and local officials are being monitored for reaching the new targets or not. Okay. Sorry. But I think I cannot really say very clearly the direction this takes right now. Yeah. So this is really stuff for future research. I want to be careful here, actually, to be honest.
Thank you very much. Maybe we could open to the floor. If there are any questions from, could you please raise your hand? And if you also want to write on the chat.
There's a dog. Maybe he wants to ask a question.
Yeah, that's right. I think the dog is with Karen.
Yeah, exactly.
Karen is Botelho's wife.
Okay, hang on. Hi, I'm here. Hello.
Hi, Karen.
So you mentioned this a couple of times, and I'm sorry, I was actually, but why is the government having such a fraught relationship, such a tense relationship with some of the online teaching and video game companies, which are listed on the stock exchange and are considered symbols of China's, technological strength, and the government is just sorry, do you want me to repeat it? Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So why is the government confronting these firms so head on?
Well, the official rhetoric is that kids play hours and hours and hours every day, and this should be forbidden. They say it's only, I think, 1 or 2 or 3 hours per week or so. Yeah. And what the government does is they say that's what you do now. So the argument was it saves our kids, and maybe the subtext is it leads them to learn more and to give everything they have to achieve their Gaokao, so the kind of entrance exam to universities and so forth. Yeah. So it is a bit productivist, if you like. Yeah. Students lose, or young guys lose their time by playing out. I mean, that's of course true. Yeah. I mean, not only in China, of course. Yeah. But here the government, I think, argues along these lines. And then online teaching, these private teachers, I think this is also more related to this high quality growth idea, and the idea of easing a bit the pressure on parents who have a very hard time bringing their kids through school. It's very time consuming and very expensive, for instance, to pay private tutors. So that's the thing that I have read about lately. And I think for this reason, they have attacked these private tutors, for instance. That, of course, has an impact because people lose their job. I mean, for many people, that's their source of income, their only source of income. But the initial, I think, initial aim was to kind of ease some pressure. But there's, in my view, this has not been resolved so far. Yeah, because what's the alternative now? Yeah, well, I think this is an ongoing process, which we should follow on a little bit. I think it's maybe too early also to tell what this means. Are they going underground now, and the parents are paying them privately or whatever? So I really don't know. So I think that many things can happen here.
Okay, so I was discussing this issue with a friend who's Chinese, and he said it's the government and no evidence whatsoever, which is why I'm throwing this at you. But he said these firms are getting too powerful. The government wanted to control them, and it just, to me, I don't understand why firms that are fulfilling the government's objective are the ones that are getting batted down.
Yeah, but as I mentioned, I mean, I think we have to differentiate here. So for online or to private tutors, these are normally not people from very big firms. So this is a kind of new job these are new jobs that have to emerge over the last couple of decades. And there's a reform going on. Regarding big tech, yes, it is an attack on those firms with international repercussions, of course. On the other hand, I mean, this is my initial thought on this. As I mentioned before, that the government, I think, is trying to keep control, and they want to be very clear. On the other hand, control over finance and data, I think these are the two key items. And then a firm like Alibaba is a kind of potential countervailing power, yeah, in terms of control over data and control over finance. And I think this is not what the government wants to have. I think it does not. I would be surprised if they would close down on those firms. And an indication for this is, so they have now been very big on, hey, you need to spend money on good things, and you, like Tencent, you cannot only make money from making young kids addicted to senseless video games. So you should donate and stuff. However, there's no tax reform so far. So if you really want to have more money to spend on, I don't know, social equity, education, why don't you tax the big tech and the other firms? Taxes are relatively, they're not very high, but they're also not very, very low in China. Okay.
Thank you. Is there any question from the floor? Any other question?
Hello, Renan. Renan, can you speak up?
Okay. Am I being heard?
Yeah, can you speak louder, please?
Okay. Well, first, congratulations. I like it very much. I have a question. I am a sociologist, and I have a question. It's not a complaint at all. It's just a curiosity. There is a literature on modernity and sociology, some schools of thought, or presumably some schools of thought, reflexive modernity, multiple modernities, etc. As far as I could understand you, this has no relevance for you. Does it have any relevance? It's not a complaint. I just would like to know if this literature has any relevance to your discussion, to your reflection.
Yes, not in this book, not in this book. So, but in the other book that was mentioned by Moises, called China's Capitalism, which is a more broader discussion of how capitalism emerged in China and how the imperatives of capitalism in this region has led to maybe another form of modernity. Yeah. So here I use some insights from people like Johann Paul Arnason, who, building on Eisenstadt, Schlum, Eisenstadt, and others, has I think developed quite interesting stuff on multiple modernities, which is still arguing that there is a core of, let's say, shared values and imperatives that are all alike in different modernities, yeah. But there's still variation in terms of how modernity plays out in different regions, including the Chinese one. So in this book, there is a part in which I refer a little bit to this debate on modernity, multiple modernities, and other things. So if you are interested, have a look there. The other book, the new book, which is going to be a very short book, there's no space at all to discuss these issues. For the Chinese government, this is relevant, because what they would argue is that I speak here as if I was the government, they would argue what the Chinese, so there's a different form of civilization that they adhere to. Yeah, and that is also a legitimization for having a very different set of political power structures and institutions, for instance, than in the West. And they would argue, hey guys, don't be imperialist, if you like, and try to tell us what modernity looks like. Maybe there are different forms of modernity, or what they call civilizations out there, which are maybe which could maybe coexist. So that's at least some of the debates that are going on in China these days.
Yeah, just add in Renan's comment. There is this new movement in China, which is lion flat, which is precisely sort of an opposition and resistance to this meritocratic mindset. And also, I wonder whether these researches, such as the World Value Survey and other researches related to social values, do they indicate changes in the sense of more autonomy, or more what Engelhardt calls self-expression values? But again, you said it very properly. It's also the underlying assumptions of this kind of surveys, the idea of you have one size fits all modernity, and I think that well, maybe you could make some comments on that.
I have a further question if no one else from the audience has one. I'd like to just address a question about the missing elephant in the room about China, which has to do with the international dimension now in the geopolitical situation. In particular, linking to the technological development. It seems like China is facing like two battles. Okay, it has to promote technological development, but at the same time has to promote a strong army, and so there'll be like a divided efforts, for developing technology for the military and industrial effort for the military. There's been a big push in that. I've been doing work on shipbuilding. You see that very clearly. There's been a lot of dual development there. A lot of shipyards and working close. You have civilian ships and military ships next to each other, and there's been a lot of complaints or noise about how there's been a tech transfer of, illegal tech transfer from foreign shipbuilders who transfer technology to China. Now this is being built into military. So I just wonder if you could address that, Tobias, specifically whether, because you showed some numbers about patents, about expenditures. And we know that military expenditures can grow very fast, and to what extent the military expending can choke off the civilian and even the basic research that you mentioned hasn't taken off. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Not many, I have to say. But this is, of course, a very interesting field of research, also dual use technologies and the like. What I can tell is that, of course, also out of historical experience, militaries in other countries have been extremely innovative. Yeah, so the U.S. military, of course, the case in point here, and I wouldn't be surprised if in the Chinese military we see some sort of innovations. But I'm really not an expert on this, and probably much more with the shipbuilding and stuff. This I can't really comment on. What I can comment on is that, of course, the new Cold War, if you like, is of course very important to understand the overall development, especially of this indigenous innovation period. Most China scholars would argue the indigenous innovation was solely the result of domestic efforts and institutions and blah blah blah. Yeah, and that's true to some extent, and that's also the story we tell in the book. But what we also tell is that, of course, you need to have these external background and sometimes not really background, but really directly affecting central government policies. You need to keep that in mind. There's an interesting note here, maybe, that for the Chinese government, in some sense, this new competition is also a chance to put pressure on the local coalitions. So in some sense, they kind of translate this conflict between two countries into the task of now achieving more and more innovations. It's kind of collaborations to survive. Yeah, that's the idea behind. Yeah, this is also, of course, not new. People like Benros Schneider and others have talked about this for decades. But this maybe pops up in a new situation here, and especially with regard to China. And then the other question, I have to be honest, I can't really comment on this. The survey, the value surveys. I don't have any evidence, so I'm just not aware of what it says. This I really can't comment on.
Okay. Any further questions from the audience? Anyone?
Yeah. Well, if there isn't any, just a final question, because I very much like your research and the way you were going deeper into the context. I mean, it's not this the traditional IP international relations approach, which tends to be rather superficial on the domestic structures. But my question is about, I heard Streeck saying that China is not imperialist, and they don't want to impose their lifestyle to other countries, and it's not like I mean, there is some soft power, but it's not and it seems that in the German press, for example, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, most of the time, and also the Economist, Financial Times, there is always this idea, which is very much in the commonplace in the public opinion, about China being aggressive, China being imperialistic, and well, if you could have a word about that.
Yeah, if intended or not, if you become a strong player in this world, you start to behave something which many would call imperialist. I think that also holds for China. However, it's not only holding for China, of course, and that's the problem, I think, in the debate. It's very one-sided. Yeah, what is happening is a new player emerges on the scene, and yes, this player has interests, and this player wants to have a say on certain issues, especially in its region. Yeah, so far so good in terms of practical military-like activities. I mean, there are these conflicts in the South China Sea and so forth. And wait a second, when it comes to Taiwan, this is really a very sensitive issue. If we get a new government in Taiwan, which is very anti-Chinese, I cannot guarantee that because China wants to take back Taiwan at some point. Yeah, they officially think that's part of us. It's one of our provinces, but the international the others don't see it like us. So that could become a real problem at some point. But China is also not more imperialist than the others. Yeah, indeed, rhetorically speaking, they are very often, at least for they were still a bit careful, I would argue, when it comes to comparisons to former imperialisms around the globe. So yes, but if you like it or not, and if it's intended or not, this is a new conflict that is going on, and it cannot be resolved through rhetoric alone. Yeah? China wants to become more innovative. China wants to create and nurture big tech firms. So it's not the end of Tencent, I guess. Yeah. So that is going to be driving competition and competitive setups around the world, and this might have political repercussions, geopolitical repercussions, of course. Yeah. And in that sense, it's not nice what is happening out there. Yeah, and it's also not nice what you read in these papers, because it's very one-sided. Yeah, it is rather building up a kind of new enemy. Yeah, that's not good. That's not good.
I have one quick question since you mentioned competition, but going back to economic competition. That's my final question, I promise. It has to do going back home to you. I mean, to what extent, this Chinese innovation drive represents a threat, to German export model or not? I mean, do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, we would have to look into different industry sectors. In the car industry, is a good case in point. German car makers are very afraid to lose competitive advantages towards the Chinese, because the car of the future is built on batteries and software. And in batteries and software, that's not a particular strength of German car makers. Yeah, they were very good at producing combustion engines, but the batteries are not produced at top-notch level by the Germans. So here there is a problem, but it's also not only Chinese. The biggest battery producers, they come from Korea, Japan, from Japan, and so forth. Not just China, of course. Mm-hmm. And in other sectors, the situation, I think, still would look a little different. So if it comes to machines and some other sectors, in which the Germans still are very, very top-notch, yeah, and the Chinese have to kind of, I think, go a long way to go to the frontier. This is also why many German businesses these days are less anti-China than the political scene. Yeah, many German firms, they are still very much interested in selling their products. And yes, there is the fear, maybe a rising fear, that this is the example of car makers, of being outcompeted at some point. But so far, I think in many industries, the Germans can do quite a good business with the Chinese.
Great, thanks, Tobias.
Yeah, there was recently an interview with Sigmar Gabriel. I don't know if you read it. It's interesting. He said that there is no sense in a new code war, and China is not a problem. I can send you later. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. Thanks.
Well, shall we then? I think we if there are no further questions, we could finish our webinar. And I thank you very much, Tobias. I think we had a lively discussion here. It was streamed on the YouTube. So then I can send you. I can also send you the link for if you want to share with other colleagues and students. And so, well, and thank you for the audience. I don't know, Antonio, if you want to close with a few
No,
more
just
words.
want to also thank make your words my words. I think was thank Tobias for the excellent presentation and discussions. And I think was very enlightening for all of us, in terms of developing a better knowledge and understanding of China, the part of Brazilian international political economies, as well as establishing, continuing this dialogue we've had with you and your group, in Germany. So thanks 1,000 for that, and also thanks to your colleagues Alexandre and Armin for not being here, but I hope we can also continue engaging with them and you in the near future. Thank you very much, Tobias.
Thank you all for participating and listening and asking good questions and so forth. Yeah, this was very nice. Hope to stay in touch and see you soon. Maybe next SASE, maybe. Would there be a point in time? Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.